Hi, my name's Nick Clark, and I'm an ARC Techrophil at the University of Queensland. And today I'm going to talk to you about expected impacts of climate change on the structure and composition of Mediterranean fish communities. So the recent UN summit in Glasgow highlighted the many complicated ways that climate change is impacting economies and ecosystems. And the marine realm has really been front and center as there's mounting evidence that sea temperatures are warming around the globe. These warming seas are expected to impact the structure and function of marine communities in a variety of complicated ways. But an often overlooked impact of climate change is seasonal disparity. In many ecosystems, winter conditions are actually changing faster than summer conditions are. For example, in the Arctic, a recent modeling paper suggested that winter temperatures are warming at 4 to 5 times the rate that summer temperatures are. This is potentially very important for understanding ecosystem changes, because winter conditions are often much more limiting for the distributions or abundances of species than are summer conditions. The Mediterranean Sea is a good example of this. So this is a biodiversity hotspot with many economies that are very strongly dependent on marine resources. But a recent IPCC special report indicated that rates of sea surface temperature warming are expected to be twice as fast during winter as they are during summer. And this is potentially, again, very important for understanding possible changes to fish community compositions, but it's not really clear how these different rates of warming might impact fish communities into the future. So to try and tackle this question, we used the FishMed database. So briefly, experts from fisheries, ecology, and geography have compiled decades of research to describe the ranges of more than 600 Mediterranean fish species. This database also includes carefully curated functional trait information for each of these species, which can be really useful for understanding how functional niche spaces are filled or unfilled in particular environments. So this provides all the quality data that's needed to try and model possible changes to fish communities. But to date, all the studies that have tried to tackle this question have relied on modeling single species individually rather than jointly. And this is a limitation for trying to understand possible changes to entire communities. So given these major gaps in our knowledge of how communities might change, we chose to address 2 key research questions here. First of all, we wanted to ask how coastal fish communities are expected to change in response to changing sea surface temperatures. But secondly, do we expect to see different impacts or relative impacts of summer versus winter temperature change on the community structure of Mediterranean fish communities? So I'll briefly introduce the method that we used to answer this question, as it's really vital to understand how we can conduct inference on the ways that temperatures might impact the way that communities are structured or put together. So Markov random fields provide a way to model entire communities of datasets by formulating a probabilistic graph to model species associations in a principled way. In this type of model, the nodes in the network represent species, while the edges represent conditional associations among those species. So if we're talking about binary data, which is what most co-occurrence data is used in, each node is the ones and zeros for a species, whether it was present or not, whereas the edges represent co-occurrence probabilities of those species given their co-occurrences with all the other species in the network. And some simulation experiments have shown that this type of model is much more powerful for detecting weak or hidden associations than the more commonly used null modeling technique. But a really powerful addition to MRFs is the ability to use covariates to ask whether those co-occurrence associations are expected to change across environmental gradients. So it's a really powerful way of understanding whether species are more or less likely to co-occur as temperatures might change, for example, into the future. So we applied a spatial conditional random fields model to identify co-occurrence associations across Mediterranean coastal sites for 215 species. And we chose those species because they had adequate functional trait information available. From our models, we first of all asked whether species associations are expected to change in response to summer and winter sea surface temperatures. And then we used functional traits of those species alongside our estimated co-occurrence networks to understand whether associations are expected to be different among different functional groups. So this gave us a really unique and interesting opportunity to understand how functional diversity might change in response to changing temperatures. Finally, we used simulations from our model to apply IPCC climate scenario projections for a number of different time points to try and understand possible changes to fish communities across time. What kinds of changes would we expect to see, or would our model expect to see, given those IPCC temperature projections? So I'll go through the results briefly. Our models fit the data quite well and provided some useful and very unique insights into potential drivers of species distributions across the Mediterranean coastal shelf. First of all, for many species, the presence or absence of other species was far more important in terms of statistical effect size than were spatial predictors or sea surface temperature effects. This broadly supports a lot of previous research that including biotic effects can be really important for species distribution modeling for a number of different ways. First of all, these biotic effects might capture unmeasured environmental variation. They might act as good proxies for some covariates that were not measured, or they might actually act as proxies for direct biotic interactions such as competition or facilitation. We can't really distinguish between the two with our type of model, but either way, including biotic effects is clearly important for getting more accurate species distribution predictions. However, we did find very large differences in the relative impacts of summer versus winter temperature change. In particular, the effects of summer temperature change on species associations were on average 4 times weaker than the effects of winter temperature change. So for example, species that were more likely to co-occur in warmer waters were much more strongly likely to co-occur. So their co-occurrence association changed to a much greater degree across winter temperature gradients compared to summer temperature gradients. And the same was found for species that were less likely to co-occur, much stronger effects for winter versus summer. And this is a unique finding that strongly suggests that winter temperatures act as a more important environmental filter for limiting the co-occurrence and possible assembly of fish communities across the Mediterranean coastal shelf. A second major finding was our simulations pointed to much more abrupt changes in fish community structure as winter temperatures warmed compared to warming summer temperatures. In particular, network modularity, which describes the extent to which species from the same functional group are likely to co-occur, decreased as winter temperatures warmed. And this is shown by this graph here, where the red is the winter temperatures and the gray is summer temperatures. This decrease in modularity coincided with a decrease in species richness and expected increases in functional diversity. And collectively, this suggests that as winter temperatures warm, we expect to see losses of functional redundancy. So functionally redundant species disappear. So the species that remain, there are fewer of them, but those that are left are more functionally dissimilar. And it suggests that each niche space is still occupied, but it's occupied by fewer species as temperatures warm. And in fact, our study is not the first to find this. There have been several other studies that have shown that increases in sea surface temperatures coincide with a decrease in functional redundancy for coral reef fish assemblages across the Pacific, for example. So this suggests that, again, winter temperatures might be more important for inhibiting functional equivalence in the Mediterranean. And this might actually be a broad scale phenomenon that's not just limited to this part of the world. And we can illustrate the model in a little more detail by focusing on one particular association among 2 very important invasive species, the Spanish mackerel and the shrimp scad. Both of these are widespread invaders that have profound effects on the abundances of native species, and they're spreading rapidly throughout the Mediterranean. They showed a very strong co-occurrence association, so much more likely to co-occur when the other species was present. But because they're quite functionally different from one another, they feed on very different types of prey, their co-occurrence was modulated by winter temperatures. So you can see in this graph here, the blue shows where the species co-occurred, whereas the black shows where the species did not co-occur. And as winter temperatures warmed, and there was a much more likely co-occurrence between these species than when winter temperatures were cooler. In the summer, we saw kind of a similar effect, but this effect was broadly the same throughout the full range of summer temperatures. And again, broadly suggests that as winter temperatures reach those higher values, we're much more likely to see co-occurrence of these two species than in the cooler winter temperatures. And broadly, that suggests that as the winter temperatures warm across the Mediterranean, that might open new areas for these species to co-invade and have synergistic effects on their conspecifics. And finally, we also summarized possible range expansions or contractions for each species in our model, and we broadly found that bottom dwellers, benthic and demersal species, were more likely to show a range contraction compared to pelagic species. This is obviously just results of one cross-sectional study, but it suggests that there might be different effects on species depending on their functional traits. So in summary, we found that Mediterranean fish communities are expected to change quite abruptly across changing temperature gradients, but it's winter temperatures that seem to have more strong effects on these community dynamics. And finally, we found that winter temperatures also have a stronger driver on species co-occurrence associations, which might have very long-term impacts on community assembly of these communities into the future. So I'll just leave it there, but if you're interested in learning more about these models, please see the primary reference here. And thank you very much for your time.